have Brian Cadena joining us from the Department of Economics at the University of Colorado-Boulder. Brian is a labor economist who is very well known in the economics of immigration literature for his work in low-skilled labor markets. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of Human Resources, has published in sort of all the top journals we all dream of publishing in, the American Economic Journal Applied, American Economic Journal Economic Policy, a Review of Economics and Statistics, or envious of his CV, and he's here this week to talk about his work on the international transmission of local economic shocks through migrant networks. Thanks so much for being here, Brian.
Thanks, Joe, for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for a great day. Yes, it could probably use a snappier title, right? But I hope it's at least descriptive. So thanks very much for that. So this is it's joint work with Brian Kovac, who is a frequent co-author of mine on immigration work, and Brian's excellent PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, Maria Caballero. She's, I don't think, yet going to be on the job market, but watch out for her when she is. She's excellent, and much of this paper is due to her excellent work. Usual disclaimer. So when Brian and Maria and I got started thinking about this topic, we took as our motivation a couple of things, right? The first is when we think about the ways in which two different economies, two different countries might be integrated, we typically think of mechanisms like international trade, trade in final goods, and financial markets or capital flows as ways that those two economies might be tied together. Right? We also might think about migration as a potential channel that would integrate two different economies, but for data reasons that's been a lot harder to study. Right? It's a lot easier to see how capital or final goods flow across the world. It's harder to see how people flow, especially from particular sources and destinations. Right? And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to take advantage of some new data that we gained access to, and that's going to allow us to see how shocks on one side of an international border flow through migrant networks and create shocks on the other side of the international border, and then follow on and see what the outcomes of those shocks are. Right? And so we'll be looking at this in the US-Mexico context. We'll be thinking about the Great Recession as a labor demand shock in the US, and look to see how the Great Recession then had effects on sending regions inside of Mexico. So if you're familiar with the immigration literature, some of these things might be review, but if not, these are other sort of contextual ideas that we had in mind when we were thinking about this particular question, right? The first is just the empirical regularity that immigrants tend to cluster in locations with people from their same source country, right? That's well known, right? And then and we're going to extend that to thinking about people who are actually from the same location within a source country, right? And not just sharing a country in common, but sharing something even more finely defined in common, right? We also know that immigrant networks can, having previous migrants from your same sending location can increase migration probability, right? So, and a lot of that is likely through people finding out information about job availability, things like that. And then a piece of the literature that I've been directly involved in is thinking about the idea that migrants' location choices are responsive to what labor demand conditions look like, right? And so we also know from even another literature that we've seen that labor demand shocks in destinations can change migration patterns and change remittances, which in turn affects some other source location outcomes. It's been difficult to do that in a US-Mexico context, again, because we haven't had access to this good data. Right? So we're going to, with those sort of as motivating facts, we're going to think about the US-Mexico context and how shocks in the US then lead to outcomes in Mexico. Right? And so the specific research question, we're going to look at a variety of different outcomes, but the specific research question is what happens in migrant sending regions in Mexico when migrants and potential migrants lose access to strong foreign labor demand prospects, right? So when the US labor market gets worse, right? When job prospects for Mexican migrants get worse, what happens to outcomes in those sending locations, right? So this is not, it's not specifically about what happens as a result of return migration. We're going to think of return migration as a potential channel, right? The research question is really about when a source area loses access to strong labor market demand in the foreign country, what happens in those sending locations. right? So to do that, we're going to put together a couple of different pieces. The first is geographic variation in the depth of the U.S. Great Recession. So this is a similar source of variation that Brian Kovac and I used in our earlier paper, looking at the spatial reallocation of Mexican immigrants during the Great Recession and the impact then that had on native-born workers who are in the same labor markets. Right, so that's a variation that we've used before. And then the new piece is that we're going to be able to characterize for the first time the joint distribution of sending and receiving locations, but at a very fine level of geography between the U.S. and Mexico. So we're going to be able to know essentially at the Mexican municipio level, effectively the Mexican county level, where migrants born in that county end up at the county level in the United States. And that's going to be, we're going to use that to characterize what this migrant network looks like at a fine level of geography, right? And so, and this is, it's data that we've previously looked at, and we have a paper where we sort of vetted this data source, and I can talk more about that as we go along, but we think this is a good data source for doing exactly what we're trying to do with it.
Yeah. So just to clarify, the previous work that's looked at kind of these, push and pull factors, I've just said from anywhere in Mexico, you arrive to this particular location in the U.S. and here you're going to actually be able to tie.
Yeah, it's typically done at the source country level, right? So there are papers that put together like push factors, say in a variety of different source countries, right? But then they take advantage of the fact that migrants cluster in locations that share the same country of origin, right? But yeah, what we're going to be able to do is to drill down and say even within Mexico, there's quite a bit of variation based on county of birth and where people end up settling.
So it's not just that they're kind of these Mexican diasporas or something. It's actually, this is the diaspora for Aguascalientes. And
yes, exactly. And I'll show you. There's a map that will show you, two neighboring municipios that are right next to each other, and yet the destination distribution is incredibly different. Cool. Right. So and in fact, this paper that we wrote with Maria that came out last year was a little bit more descriptive and documenting the fact that there really is all this diversity in what these networks look like, in addition to then trying to validate the data that we have against sort of gold standard survey data sets, thinking about do the marginal distributions line up of sources and destinations so that we think that this is a reasonable data set to be using. And I'll tell you more. It's I don't need to bury it, right? We're using data from an identity card program run by the Mexican government here in the U.S., and I'll get into that. But it's a non-standard administrative data set, which is why we spent the time to actually write the paper, checking out whether we thought that this was a reasonable data set to be using. So,
yeah, with the caveats that I don't know this literature especially well, but I want to understand what can one learn from a different context and literature that's looked at migration patterns among natives due to sort of local shocks in neighboring, local shocks in neighboring states on migration patterns to different locales where you can measure in a better way than has been able to be measured in your context until now. What have we learned about those type of migration patterns among natives in responses to either policy shocks or economic shocks?
Yeah, so the big thing that you see in I'm not familiar with any work about specifically so let's see. In general, job network networks matter in terms of people finding jobs, right? But I'm not familiar with anything that says that people born in Michigan, like I am, tend to when they leave Michigan tend to cluster in places with the other people who are born there, other than for reasons like Chicago is close by and it's a nice place to live, right? So I don't know that I have a great answer to that. The big differences that I've seen are things like by skill, right? Like there's skill groups, we see big differences in people's willingness to relocate for work. Now the big thing that we're trying to do here is to take the literature, that like Ryan was mentioning, right? This clustering that we know by source country and drill down even farther. So, and what's going to be nice about that for us is that we think it's going to strengthen our identification strategy, right? Because what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to compare two Mexican sources that are really close to one another, that are a part of the same state, that are facing a bunch of the same policy changes or whatever else might be driving trends, and yet for reasons of historical accident are connected to different locations within the US, right? So that's going to make up for a much cleaner comparison when we're trying to find the impact of losing access to this strong US labor market. Okay? So that's the approach, in the end is going to be relatively straightforward. We're just going to look to see how outcomes change at the municipio level in Mexico, right, using gold standard Mexican data sources, and we're going to see how they change as a function of what the US labor demand looked like from the perspective of that municipio. All right? So when we do that, we find that Mexican sending locations, Mexican municipios that were more exposed to U.S. employment declines during the Great Recessions saw greater increases in return migration. Emigration is noisier, and we can talk about why that is, so we don't find anything there. But they do see greater population growth. We see that the sex ratio comes closer back into balance. That happens because most of the return migrants are men. Right? We do see some increases in marriage rates then among non-migrants, ages at typical marriage ages. We also see results that are consistent with sort of the typical added worker effect that you would see in a recession type, your ordinary labor economic study of a recession, right? We see that as people lose access to this strong foreign labor market, non-migrant women join the labor market, right? They are more likely to be employed, and then we see something that looks somewhat like a labor supply shift, right, where we see a decrease in hourly wages.
Why is there an increase in non-migrant women's employment?
So my interpretation is it's sort of the same as the typical added worker effect, right? Where when men lose when men lose a job in a recession, right, the other member of the household is more likely to go.
I see that their husbands arrive without jobs.
Yes, or with a lower paying job than they had in the U.S. Right? There's a loss of income because you've lost access to the U.S. employment prospects, and so to make up for that, women go to work. Yes, that's right. And then, interestingly, we also see increases in human capital investment, right? And so this one could have gone either way. There's both sort of an income and resource channel here, but then there's also an expectations channel, right? So these are typical school ages where we see where dropout tends to happen in Mexico, and so what we see, our interpretation of this result is that these are kids who previously would have had expectations of either going to the U.S. and getting employment themselves, or receiving income from the United States through a family member, and instead, they then change their expectations, thinking that that's going to be less likely to happen, and so they remain in school for longer. And so we see it in both attendance contemporaneously, and then when we look at sort of completed education for the exposed cohorts later on, we see greater increases in completed schooling.
So these are the results that you find at kind of the aggregated municipio level.
Yes.
So this is across everyone who's in the municipio, not specific to people who are actually returning or...
Right, so what we're not going to be able to track individual return migrants, okay, right? This identity card data is not going to be able to say, like, we see this person coming back from Phoenix that experienced the housing bust, and so what happened to that person's family?
But the idea is that had labor market conditions been better, you would have seen, these additional people go, and because they're staying, then you pick this up in the aggregate.
Yeah, so
okay.
right. Everything's going to be at the municipio level. We're going to compare municipios with that are tied to the strong labor markets to municipios that are tied to the weak labor markets. And the argument is people who are in places that are tied to weak labor markets change their expectations about their likelihood of moving to the U.S. Right, and then as a result, we see them doing things like, say, investing in schooling.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Not sure necessarily by your explanation for the last one, just because if you think about a recession, it's more kind of a short run thing. So how would that change alarm expectation? Is it possible this is just the fact that there's more two-parent households that are there?
It could be. No, that's fair, right? So it could be that there are now, and you know, in theory, right? So one of the things that we like about what we're doing is all of our outcomes are coming from, you know, Mexican census data at the municipal level. So in theory, we should be able to look directly at that kind of heterogeneity and see if, you know, look at household type, look at family structure, and see if the results are stronger in one group than in another. Right. Okay. I like that. Thanks. Yes, and I should have mentioned, although you probably figured it out by the fact that the body of the paper doesn't exist, right? That this is, you know, this is work that is, you know, sort of hot off the presses. I very much appreciate all of the comments and feedback that you all have offered and will offer. All right, so this set of findings makes contributions to a couple of different strands of the literature. Right, the first, again, which is where I've been spending some of my time, right, is the idea that we know that labor market shocks affect where migrants choose to locate, but what we haven't known, or that has been much more difficult to find empirically, is the possibility that labor demand shocks affect international migration, right? So the paper that we wrote earlier about the Great Recession, it showed that there was a redistribution of Mexican immigrant labor across the United States as a result of the Great Recession. What we weren't able to say was how much of we weren't able to say especially well was how much of that was about changes across, movement across the international border rather than a reshuffling of immigrants within the United States. And what this set of results is showing is that return migration was actually an important piece of how that reallocation across space was occurring, right? And then we're also contributing to this literature that looks at how destination labor demand affects outcomes in sending communities. Typically, other papers in this literature are operating at the country level, right, rather than operating at this fine level of geographic detail. And so we think that strengthens our approach. In particular, as I mentioned, it allows us to use this within Mexican state design that we think gives us some more credibility in thinking about how what our identification strategy looks like. All right. So let's jump into the meat of this, right? So the big thing that we need in order to follow our approach is to figure out what the destination distribution looks like for migrants from different source locations within Mexico, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, like, we're trying to generate spatial variation across Mexico in what the U.S. labor demand conditions look like. Right, so that's what we're trying to do. So in theory, right, a potential migrant from Mexico could consider the entire United States as a potential destination, but our argument is that people are going to place more weight on locations where people they know have already settled. Right? We aren't going to be able to measure that at the individual level, but we will be able to measure that at the municipal. Right? So for people who share a birthplace, we're going to be able to say, where are, you know, if I'm from a particular municipio, where are all of the people who have left from my municipio located within the U.S.?
Can you show, or does it look like the strength of that relationship weakens as kind of the receiving location has kind of hard economic times?
So,
like, I'm thinking of, like, as a migrant, right, you face kind of two different decisions: should I stay or go? And then conditional on if I go, where do I locate? And I understand this idea that, look, my neighbors are there, or I've got cousins that are, you know, from my, you know, town that are living there. It reduces the cost because I already have a network. But it seems like, you know, that the strength of this connection could actually also depend very much on the local labor market conditions. And is there any way you can look at kind of time varying measures of that?
So I think there is. So so the data that we have information from 2006 through to 2016, right? And that's what's allowing us to characterize this joint distribution. For this measure that we're going to be creating, we're going to use only 2006. We want to look at that sort of pre-existing distribution of where people were. It would, in theory, be possible to look directly in this data to see where, like, if we see the destination distribution shifting within source, right? we certainly could look at that. If that were happening, though, it may be happening. It's going to tend to like dampen the effect that I'm finding, right? Because what that would do is instead of people coming back, like instead of net return migration increasing, it might like shift back towards zero, right? If what people do instead is just pick new destinations, right? So the first order question is sort of like, are these networks important enough that a decline in labor market prospects at the destinations where people typically go is strong enough to actually send people back to Mexico?
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, I don't bring this up as an issue with your identification strategy, but it seems that given that you have kind of variation in the returns to migrating in these like location-specific returns, right?
Yes.
You might actually, I mean, this would be a whole other kind of road to wander down, but it'd be interesting to see like how bad do the labor conditions have to get before I start looking elsewhere to go? And you could, in some sense, kind of try to back out some kind of implicit value of having this connection, or what,
Sure.
How tied to this one location am I?
Yeah, so I'll show you, it's more than just one location, right? And so what I think is probably more likely is like, how bad does it have to get before I shift over to this part of the destination mix where there are some people but not a lot of people, right? Rather than like just like go and become a pioneer and go somewhere totally different where no one's ever been. Yeah.
Just a quick question about your network measure.
Yeah.
Do you control it all for the size of the destination? What I'm thinking of, you have San Diego County, which is a lot of people.
Yep.
A little east of here is Imperial County, which is not as many people.
Yes.
There's a lot of Mexican migrants living in Imperial County, but maybe the share of migrants in San Diego is bigger. But the network, in effect, is actually much stronger in Imperial County because it's a bigger presence that's there.
That's the proportion, right?
Well, it's a proportion of total migrants, but you could also divide it by the destinations, let's say, share of the U.S. population or something like that. So, like, a smaller place that has a lot more Mexican migrants, maybe that's a more important network.
Yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of like, if what I was trying to describe. So in fact, like, so in the previous paper, what we looked at was, we were trying to look at the diversity in these networks, and we were, what we were looking at is we were comparing like what's the distribution for people from this source relative to the distribution of all Mexican immigrants, right? And and that was sort of how we were describing how much variation there was there. What we're thinking about here is this is going to become a weight so that we're going to take a weighted average of the U.S. labor market conditions, right? So it really does sort of matter like where all of the people are in terms of what labor market changes they're experiencing over time.
I mean, the only thing I was really thinking is, I just think there's Los Angeles, there's a lot of people there, but because it's such a big city, it may not feel like a network, right? Because it's not necessarily a cohesive community, which is what we're talking about as sort of a network.
Yeah, I see. So in theory, right, so it's a rough characterization of what this weight is like, and this weight may, in terms of like how people think about how important different locations are, they may actually place more weight than I'm giving it on places that are small. Right. Yeah, no, that'd be worth it'd be worth thinking about whether our results are robust to that. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so. Yeah, so the key thing that we're trying to measure here is what share of Mexican immigrants from source from source S end up in destination D, right? And so why can't we do that with sort of standard survey data sets? Well, if you open up a standard survey data set, this is what your geography looks like, right? So if you open up the ACS or another census data product, what you see is you know where people are in the U.S. and you know that they are from Mexico. Right? If you open up the Mexican census and you can see where people are from, right? And you can, through a variety of questions, know whether they've sent a family member to the U.S., whether they've recently come back from the U.S., right? So you can get either of these marginal distributions relatively easily in gold standard data sets, right? The destination distribution, the source distribution. But what's tough is to figure out what that joint distribution looks like at a finer level of geography. Okay. There do exist some other data sets out there that look at the joint distribution, but each one of them is problematic for at least one reason, right? So there's the Mexican Migration Project. That is not designed to have full coverage of the entire country of Mexico, right? There's the NRI, which is like the Mexican CPS, right? It has state-to-state information, but it's a relatively small sample. right? There's another specialized survey that is run at border locations that is potentially interesting, but the questions are about intended destinations, not actually realized destinations where people end up. And all of these alternative data sets have very small samples, and so if you're trying to think about like filling in a matrix of sources and destinations, you're going to end up with a bunch of empty cells, right? And so what we're going to use instead is data from an identity card program that's run by the Mexican consulates here in the United States. Right? So we're going to use tabulations from this program, and so these are identity cards that are issued primarily to unauthorized immigrants. Right? Any Mexican citizen may receive one of these cards who's living in the United States, right? But they're of most value to an unauthorized migrant. Right? They are used as an official form of identity in the United States, right? So they don't say anything about your legal status, but they do prove two things. They prove that you are who you say you are, and they prove that you live where you say you live, right? So in order to get one of these cards, you have to bring documents to the consulate that are proof of your identity, and you also have to bring proof of local residence. So something like a lease, utility bill, right? The same thing that you might use to get a U.S. driver's license. Right? And so what we're able to get out of this, right, is we'll end up with tabulations where we know, because they're proving place of residence and a place of birth, right, we're able to get tabulations at that fine level of geography. So in theory, we could know addresses. We did not ask for addresses. We asked for tabulations at the county level. Okay?
So, and I don't know if the little coverage button gets at this. Do we have a sense for how many, like what share of total migrants have these cards? Like,
we do, yeah. So it's on the order of about 75%. Yeah. So take up is really high, right? And so it's it comes from like a rough back of the envelope calculation, right? But if we calculate, they're valid for 5 years. So if we sort of add up 5 years worth of issuances and compare that against estimates of the stock of the unauthorized population, you get to numbers that are about 75%. Right? You can use this card to open a bank account. You can use this card to get an ITIN, right, which will allow you to file taxes. You can use this card to interact with state and local governments. There was a lawsuit in Texas about whether Texas had to accept this identity card for unauthorized migrants trying to get birth certificates for their citizen children, right? And so you need to prove that you are who you say you are to get your kid's birth certificate. That lawsuit was eventually decided in favor of yes, you can use this card, right? So it's a very valuable thing to use, and people who have intentions to be here for a relatively long amount of time are very likely to get one.
But there's a lot of selectivity in terms of what states in the U.S. they're gonna want to do this, because in some states the benefits and the costs will be very different from other states, right?
Yes, I agree. So we were concerned about that. So in our previous paper, we looked at things like this is the marginal distribution of where the cards are issued versus where Mexican immigrants are located within the United States. Right. So it's the log share from the ACS versus the log share of card issuances. Right. It's not exactly on the 45-degree line, but it's pretty close, right? So it doesn't seem like that. I agree with you that in theory, right, this is why we wrote the previous paper, right? Is that we weren't sure that we could use these card issuances to do exactly what we were trying to do with them, but we vetted them, and it seems like this is the destination distribution, this is the source distribution, this is the source distribution at the Mexican municipio level, right? It certainly seems like that if to the degree that there is selectivity, it's not especially problematic, right? And again, what we might end up doing, say, is if there's one state where very few people get it, then we end up with every municipio's share for that destination is lower than it should be, right? But we still think there's useful variation in saying like this municipio's share is higher in that destination than this other municipio is, right? So really, it's about trying to get that relative share correct. Yeah.
You said the card doesn't designate that they're actually unauthorized.
Correct.
But in what sense is it like a marker for being unauthorized immigrant?
Yeah, it's a pretty strong marker. It's a pretty strong marker because if if you had, say, a Mexican passport with a valid visa, you could use that as a form of legal identification, right? So yeah, it pretty much would tell someone that you are an unauthorized migrant, and yet it's accepted as a form of legal ID for a lot of things that you'd like to do, like open a U.S. bank account. Right? To open a U.S. bank account, you need to prove who you say you are, and you need to reside in the U.S. Right? And so, because it confers both of those things to a bank, it's a pretty valuable thing to have. So. So again, we were concerned about whether we could use this data set to do what we want to do with it. That's why we wrote the previous paper, right? And then what it's going to allow us to do is to figure out for each source municipio how exposed they are to each potential U.S. destination. So we have this at the municipio of birth and the county of the U.S. We're actually going to aggregate up the U.S. destinations to be at the commuting zone level, right? But we in theory have full coverage of both entire countries.
Yeah. Sorry, how do these identification cards work in terms of state e-verify policies? Can they be used
I don't believe so. No, because let's see, it would prove that you are who you say you are, but having legal presence and authorization to work is an entirely separate concept. Yeah. So, and in fact, in this paper, right, as sort of a proof of concept, we looked at how we characterized each municipio in terms of how important Arizona was in that municipio's network. Right? And then we looked at what happened around the time of the Legal Arizona Workers Act, which we know led to a decline in likely unauthorized population in Arizona, and we see net return migration was stronger in places that were more tied to Arizona, right? So I think, in terms of, it doesn't say anything about legal status, it doesn't let you get a job, but it does let you get an ITIN. So if you're paid as a contractor, right, and you want to then file a federal tax return, right, because you got a 1099 from your employer, right, it allows you to file for not a social security number, but a tax identifier number that you can use to interact with the IRS, right? Having one of these cards would allow you to do that.
And so I've heard about the Texas case that you were sort of describing before. What other actions have other states taken to try to not permit the use of this ID for various economic activities?
I don't know if I have any other great examples. If you Google it, I have seen websites that are, that say like IDs for illegals, there are certain there are outside groups that are trying to get people to boycott private don't bank with this bank, they accept this card, right? So I've seen that sort of thing, but there's not, I haven't seen a lot of other states might, let's see. If states allow unauthorized migrants to receive driver's licenses, they typically will accept this as proof of identity to get one, but really the policy choice is whether you're allowing unauthorized migrants to get a driver's license or not, right? So it's really just about identity, and then a bunch of the other state choices are in other domains. Okay, so this picture is most of the paper, right? Most of the paper is in this picture. So what this map shows is these two maps show the destination distribution for two different municipios in the Mexican state of Guanajuato. Okay, so on the left is the destination distribution for migrants who were born in Dolores Hidalgo, and on the right are for immigrants born in Parral de Progreso. Okay, so what you see is here, right? The destination distribution is strongly tied to Texas. Right? And for this municipio, it's more Southern California, Las Vegas, and commuting zones in Arizona. Right? If you know anything about the Great Recession, right? Texas actually did reasonably well through the Great Recession, and especially Las Vegas and Phoenix were hit incredibly hard by the housing bust. Okay, so the idea is, I've chosen these two municipios on purpose because they're from the same state, right? Is we're going to make within state comparisons of municipios that are tied to labor markets that survived the Great Recession relatively well against labor markets that were hit hard by the Great Recession. Right? So this is the type of comparison that we're going to be making in the analysis that we do. Okay? So this is just one example, right? But this actually comes from our previous paper where we were trying to just in in a comprehensive way, summarize how much variation there was in what these networks looked like. And so what we were looking at was this dissimilarity index, where we said, what share of migrants from a source would a planner have to reallocate in order to get this distribution to match some reference distribution, right? The gray bars are what that index looks like across municipios when you treat the distribution of all Mexicans as of Mexican migrants as the reference distribution, right? And we're not using that. We're using instead sort of thinking about the within state variation. That's what the open bars represent, right? So still for the typical municipio in Mexico, that the most of the mass is between 0.2 and 0.5. That says that there's enough variation in what this destination mix looks like that in that typical municipio, you'd have to move 20 to 50% of the migrants around in a systematic way in order to get that municipio's destination distribution to be on top of the overall distribution for migrants from that state. So we have quite a bit of variation that is consistent with this picture. All right. Good. So the U.S. labor demand variation that we're going to use, again, it's similar to what we used in our previous paper. We're going to use county business patterns data. That's nice because it's the universe of payroll employment at a fine level of geography. And the big thing that we're going to do is we're going to begin with county by industry level changes in employment, and then we're going to weight those by the industry share of Mexican immigrants as measured in the ACS, right? So the idea here is we're trying to measure what does the change in employment for the types of jobs that Mexican immigrants are likely to work in, what does that look like by commuting zone to commuting zone? That looks like this, right? Again, Vegas, Arizona hit relatively hard. Darker means more negative, right? And Texas did relatively well through the Great Recession, right? So our key measure here is just going to be the U.S. labor demand, the change in U.S. labor demand as faced by a migrant from source S is going to be a weighted average of the change in Mexican relevant employment from 2006 to 2010, where the weights are those weights that I showed previously.
To what extent is the variation in the shocks in U.S. labor demand endogenous and actually a function of closeness to Mexico? Because I don't think it's random that, there's many reasons why Texas did well, for example, but could there also be something endogenous about what was happening in Mexico at that time?
Sure. So there certainly could be. In our previous paper, we dealt with that endogeneity by thinking about things like Bartik instruments, right? We could do that here as well. It didn't really change the result, right? And so the argument that we're using here is that what we saw was, we saw employers reacting on the quantity rather than the wage margin, right? And so we're sort of able to identify changes looking at employment and using that to sort of calculate the degree of the change in labor demand. But let's see, in terms of distance to Mexico, we could. So I suppose we could think about that. I guess I'm trying to figure out how that leads to endogeneity in. Let's see.
Okay, well, there could be some demand for something causing an increase in demand for workers in Mexico at that time.
Oh, I see.
That simultaneously also creates jobs in Texas, because some of the lawyers and all kinds of people are serving Mexicans across the border.
Yes.
No,
I get it, right? So if there are unobserved pull factors in Mexico that are bringing migrants back home, that could lead to changes in employment in the destinations where they're connected.
You're assuming that demand shock is exogenous, but
that's right. No, that's right.
Not necessarily exogenous.
So so far, what we're able to do is, if there are any pull factors that are operating in Mexico that are common across municipios within the same state, then we're controlling for that because we're going to use a within-state design, right? If there are other pull factors that are operating at an even finer level of geography, then that's something that we need to think about developing a control for, right? So one that we've thought, it's not related to to a pull factor per se, but one other potential thing that could be operating is, to the extent that Mexican municipios are differentially specialized in creating exports for the U.S., right? They could, like the Great Recession could be affecting outcomes in Mexico through a different channel, right? And another thing we've looked at is, drug violence. Right? Violence in Mexico could be leading to people being more or less willing to come back to their place of origin. Right? That doesn't, we can't get that for our full sample, but for the chunk that we can, it seems to be relatively uncorrelated with the shock.
Are you controlling for physical distance between the U.S. city and Mexico? Because what I have in mind would be related to, like some Mexicans might just cross the border to Texas to get all kinds of products, and that the economy of Texas would be doing better precisely because in part of the return migration of so many Mexicans who still buy in America.
Sure. So, I mean, let's see.
So the physical distance would be a factor.
Right. So let's see. So I think even if
not just the physical distance, but how easy it is to access, because it could be big mountains in Chihuahua. It's not so easy.
Right. So I think that's a fair critique, right? But what we're going to end up doing, right, is we're going to take these demand changes as given, and we're going to compare two municipios that are connected to these different destinations, right? So that are differentially connected to these two different destinations. So it's not, even if we're getting that measure slightly wrong, right? Even if that's partially endogenous, it's not clear that it's endogenous because people are going back to this particular municipio. Right? It could be that we're not getting that demand measure quite right? But we're still like, I also think that if we're getting Texas wrong, if we're getting the Texas demand measure wrong, it should lead us away from finding something, because it would mean that we're sort of overstating how much variation in demand conditions there was across space, right? And instead we are finding that this measure seems to matter. Right? But it's definitely worth thinking about whether there are other ways that we could, think about, pull factors or push factors that then are leading to municipio-specific variation.
I wonder one way you can maybe get at this would just be to like throw out all the border municipios or even the border states.
Yes,
and just say, look,
thank you. Yeah.
Here's like if the border's right there, fine. I'll hop across back and forth. But take it away, then you've kind of taken away this like really short commuting distance kind of measure, and then and do the same thing on the U.S. side. So then you're really looking at Midwest versus like Washington State versus these are substantial distances that probably aren't going to be susceptible to.
But the change in demand in the U.S. commuting zone is the point I'm making here, which doesn't really the people come to San Diego from Mexico to buy at Nordstrom. They might be flying. It's not so much about the municipio as about the commuting zone's economy is a function of Mexicans buying products in that place, and part of them are migrants who came back or people who did not migrate.
But I think if you were to throw out kind of the border areas, then you're really restricting it to the people who are hopping on a plane to go to Chicago to go and shop there and then come back.
So we've done the restriction on the Mexican side. We've thrown out municipios that physically touch the border. We've thrown out municipios within 100 miles of the border, but we haven't thought about restricting to using only the variation in this picture that isn't related to the border.
I would also restrict the commuting zone.
Yes, no, I understand, and that's a robustness check that we should do. All right, so let's see. I told you about this. Good. So if we then take that weighted average and look at what the variation looks like across Mexico, it looks something like this. We are not using municipios that have effectively no history of migration to the U.S., right? Because what we're looking at is changes in migration rates over time, and so if there's effectively no variation there, no history of migration, then it's not very informative. And also, for those places, we have relatively few of these ID cards, which means we can't really characterize the distribution of destinations well, right? But for the ones that we do have data for, this is what that variation looks like. As I think we're anticipating, right, places that are, municipios that are closer to the US border do seem to be more affected by these shocks by this measure, but this is not the comparison we want to make, right? We don't want to compare a municipio that's right on the US border with municipios elsewhere. Instead, what we want to do is use that within municipio variation, like from the map that what I showed you before. So this picture is actually our identifying variation. This is the within state variation in what those U.S. demand shocks look like. So it's, you know, the municipio's actual demand shock minus the state average, the average for the state that contains that municipio. You see, this gets rid of that geographic pattern, right? And now we sort of have, you know, darker blue areas and lighter blue areas spread more or less evenly throughout the country. Okay, so that's the variation that we're going to end up using. All right, so once we have that measure, right, then the analysis is relatively straightforward. We're just going to look at how migration rates, so the first thing we'll look at, is migration rates, right, and we're going to look at how they changed in response to this U.S. employment shock, right, so we're going to look at long differences from 2005 to 2010 in what migration rates look like. This D, again, is that weighted average of U.S. employment changes. And in order to get that within state variation, we're going to include Mexican state fixed effects in a difference regression that, or with a difference y, those Mexican state fixed effects are effectively state-specific trends, right? So we're going to be evaluating everything relative to those state-specific trends. In terms of the context of what we're seeing in return migration and emigration over this time period, right? This is data from the Mexican census, right? From the late 90s through the middle of the first decade of this millennium, right? You see that there was much more emigration than there was return migration. So net migration to the U.S. Was rather strong over that time period. In the time period that surrounds the Great Recession, you see a large increase in return migration. The return migration rate nearly quadruples over this time period, and it's then balanced out by emigration. So net migration is close to zero in that time period. And then, I forget who I was talking to earlier, but someone asked, can you do something moving into the future? And the answer is possibly yes, right? We can think about as the economy recovers. That's not the focus of what we're looking at now, but you see that, you know, as the economy recovers in the U.S., again, the balance is toward more emigration, right? So in the time series, right, the time series data matches the pattern that we have in mind, which is as the U.S. economy strengthens, or when the U.S. economy is strong, there's a lot of emigration to the U.S. When the U.S. economy weakens, there's much more return migration, right? The goal of what we're doing is to look at this same sort of pattern, but using spatial variation rather than just looking at the time series. Okay? But certainly the time series is consistent with the overall mechanism that we have in mind. All right, so our migration measures are of differing availability and differing quality, right? The return migration rate comes from three different Mexican census products. There's the full census in 2000 and 2010, and then the 2005 conteo, which is a little bit smaller. Right? What's nice about the return migration rate is it comes from the question, where did you live 5 years ago? That's on the short form, so we have it for the universe. And so when we're trying to get an outcome at a fine level of geography, it's nice if the underlying data is large, right? So we're able to calculate our return migration rate. You might quibble with the phrase return migration rate. What it actually is return migrants divided by the existing municipio population. So it's more like return migration's contribution to population growth rather than like the share of return migrants, or sorry, the share of previous migrants who decided to return. Right, so that's what this return migration rate looks like. We're going to be interested in the log of this. Right? We think that this relationship is likely to operate in a percentage way rather than in a level. Right? We think that sources that already had that tend to send a lot of migrants to the U.S. would see a larger response in terms of return migration to the same shock, and we think that's likely to operate in a percentage way. The immigration rate comes from a unfortunately lower quality data source, right? It's also in the census, but it's a long form question, right? So we only have about 10% of the number of underlying observations to calculate the immigration rate. It's only available in 2000 and 2010, right? And it also has this problem where it's going to omit whole household migrants, because the way that we're able to identify immigration is they ask a household that's currently still in Mexico, did anyone leave this household and go to the US, right? So we're going to present results for the immigration rate for completeness, right? Because we did look at it, right? But we think it's in general a lower quality measure, and so we're not going to be too surprised when what we end up finding is noisy zeros for the immigration rate. Okay, so when we look at the change in the log return migration rate in response to this U.S. employment shock, right? What you see this. So across a variety of ways of thinking about pre-trends, right? What you see a strong negative relationship between the change in U.S. Employment and return migration. So what that means is for sources that were connected to more negative demand shocks, right? Those places saw more return migration into the source municipio. Okay. In terms of, so there's different ways of controlling for pre-trends, right? We can control for what was happening from 95 to 2000. In columns 1 and 2, we're just looking at the difference in return migration rates from the 2005-2010 window and the 2000-2005 window, right? We can stop imposing the restriction that coefficient is 1, and the data tells us that it's not 1, right? But no matter how we deal with these pre-trends, right, we end up with this coefficient on the order of -3. Right? That -3, right, should be interpreted in terms of what's a reasonable difference in the U.S. employment shock across municipios, and the answer there is about 0.1. Right? So about 0.1. Here's the scatter plot for the return migration effects of each dots of municipio, right? These are the this is the residualized version of the U.S. employment shock that's taken out the state fixed effects. Same thing here for the change in the return migration rate, is taking out the state fixed effects, right? And so if you think about moving from a municipio at -0.05, from plus 0.05, so this is a municipio that's connected to labor demand shocks that are on average about 5 percentage points less bad than the typical municipio in that state, and you compare that against a municipio over here at -0.05, that's a municipio that was connected to U.S. demand shocks that were about 5 percentage points worse than the typical municipio in that state, right? That's a difference in the X variable of about 0.1. So for that comparison, what you would expect is that the municipio connected to worse shocks sees its return migration rate increase by about 30%. Okay, that may seem large, except that, as I showed you in the descriptives, right, the overall change in the return migration rate was about a quadrupling. Right? So return migration really was going up over this time period, and so even a 30% larger increase in return migration seems plausible. All right, and again for emigration, we get unfortunately noisy zeros. Okay, so then the next thing we want to know is are these migration effects that we're identifying meaningfully large, in a way that we would expect that we might actually see some outcomes, some further downstream outcomes occurring in response to these changes in migration. So in order to do that, what we need to do is think about, because what I was showing you were percentage changes in return migration rates, we need to translate what's happening in terms of basically bodies, right? How many people are now in the source municipio who would not have been there in the absence of the shock?
Sorry, to catch you before you get into this exercise.
Mm-hmm.
This 0.1 change, is there I'm trying to wrap my, I understand how it works in the data, but
yeah.
Can you give us 2 different towns in the US that would basically be
Yeah, sure.
like some just kind of intuitive grasp of what that.
Sure. So
that
let
might
me.
want
So
change
these
the-
two that I showed you,
Yeah.
right? This is the difference is actually 0.15
Oh,
between
okay.
these two, right? So for this map, if your destination distribution looked like this with a lot of Las Vegas and Phoenix, right? The shock was about minus 0.2, right? And although I don't know what the mean, well, they have the same mean because they're from the same
Sure. Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
state, right? So, but this with much more concentration in Texas, that's at about minus 0.05,
Okay.
right? So this that's even bigger than that 0.1. This comparison here.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So that's the idea, right? We connected really badly to the housing shock, mostly avoided the housing shock. That's the kind of comparison that we're making. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So the exercise here is primarily just to get the units right, so that we're now thinking about the how many people were moved, right, as a result of the shock. And so basically we're just taking our predicted values out of what we've done and plugging in a shock of 0 and saying what's the actual return migration rate that you would expect, that the previous regressions would predict based on the shock that was actually observed versus if there was a shock of 0, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this measure, this return migration rate measure, and use that as our independent variable in all of the outcomes that follow. Okay, so what I want you to think about this as is facing a big enough shock such that it moved a certain percentage of migrants back to Mexico, right? And typically we're going to be thinking about a 1 percentage point population growth due to return migration. So it's a shock big enough to move that many people.
Yeah, you keep giving examples of the housing construction. So where in your model do you include the gender of the migrants or potential migrants and the their education, which would be related to their chance of being a construction worker?
Sure. Okay. So what we're actually doing, right? You're right. I'm leaning a bit on the housing example, which is a large share of Mexican male employment. Right, but what we're actually doing is for each destination, we're taking the observed industry mix for Mexican migrants in that destination and taking a weighted average. So if the gender mix is different in a particular destination, so will the industry mix. The industry mix will also be different, but we're going to take weighted averages of changes in industrial employment using what we actually observe the industry mix to be in the American Community Survey.
Prior to the recession?
Exactly. We're taking the 2006 industry mix observed for Mexican immigrants as a large group, right, across all genders, and we're using those weights to take weighted averages of the changes in industry level employment.
If your sample is big enough, I would recommend having it separate by gender. Because we already know from labor economics and
we've done a little bit with that.
Men and women have to be modeled separately for most purposes of,
Sure.
of a labor supply. So the same would hold with respect to this, which is all based on employment.
That's right.
And some of the secondary earners might have actually gotten better job opportunities in the U.S. as a result of the recession.
So we have we've looked at that a little bit, right? At the moment, we're not sure where it belongs in the paper, but what we have looked at return migration rates separately by gender using shocks calculated separately by gender,
Okay.
and what we saw was both genders actually seem to respond more to male employment prospects rather than, we didn't really see much response for either gender in terms of female employment prospects, right? So I think that's reasonably consistent with what you had in mind, and maybe it's worth plugging that back in. That was actually Maria's idea. She thought of that.
Who?
My other co-author. Right. So it's other Brian and me, right, who've been working in this area for a while, and his excellent PhD student, and it was her idea to look into that. So, yeah. Great. Okay, so now we've got this measure. Again, I want you to think about this as, how bad was the shock in terms of how many people it moved back into Mexico, and have in mind, in terms of a magnitude, the 90-10 gap in this measure is about 1 percentage point worth of people moved back into Mexico. Right? The first thing we need to show is that that's actually related to population growth. Right? If we don't control for pre-trends, we're at a noisy 0, but once we control for previous trends in population, we get a strong positive number here, which suggests that we actually are seeing population growth change differentially in places that were more connected to these shocks. All right, so then we want to think about some of these other downstream some of these other downstream outcomes, right? In order to think about where we should expect to see what some of those downstream outcomes are, it's useful to understand who the return migrants are. The return migrants are much more likely to be male. About 70% of the return migrants are male. So this is just descriptively who are the return migrants. I can't tell you who the marginal return migrant is, but still about 70% of return migrants are male, more than half of them are married. In terms of their education distribution, it's sort of a middle distribution relative to the overall population of Mexico. That's consistent with some earlier work showing that migrant selection is again sort of that intermediate selection for migration from Mexico. They are more likely than the overall population to be employed. They're also a little bit more likely to be self-employed, and in terms of their wages, they're about average. They are also much more likely to be drawn from ages 20 to 40 or so. Right? So in terms of thinking about where we might find outcomes, we're thinking about moving this profile of person back into Mexico. Right? But I should say that if this were, there's a reason that we're not thinking of this as like an IV strategy. Right? We don't think that return migration is the only mechanism by which a municipio losing access to a strong foreign labor market could affect outcomes. Right? As we mentioned, we were thinking about expectations. We're thinking about potentially loss of income through remittances, as well as actually moving people, right? So there are multiple different mechanisms. I don't want to make a claim that it's just about moving people back into Mexico. Okay, so a little bit of almost housekeeping here, right? We're going to be looking at outcomes that are, so to be clear, these ID card data we're using only to get that shock measure that's separate by municipio. We are not using it for any of our outcomes. I wasn't using it for the return migration outcomes. Those were all measures that came from Mexican census data, right? So all of our outcomes are also going to come from Mexican census data. Many of them can be measured in 2000, 2005, and 2010. Some of them can only be measured in 2000 and 2010, right? In our preferred specification, we're going to look at outcomes in the 2005 to 2010 time period, controlling for pre-trends as a function of this shock that we're interested in, right? When we're unable to do that, when we can only look at a change from 2000 to 2010, what we'll do is we'll control for this change in population from 2000 to 2005. That's to isolate the same variation in the shock that we showed led to the population growth, right? The differential population growth. So again, we prefer the top research design when we can use it, but I'll be showing you results that use both of those different designs. All right. This is just an example looking at sex ratio, which is a reasonably mechanical outcome, right? If you increase return migration, you're going to change the sex ratio. It's going to come farther back into balance, right? What I want to show you here is that no matter which of those methodologies I showed you, right, we're getting a very consistent answer across the ways that we're thinking about whether we use either the 2005 to 2010 change or the 2000 to 2010 change, right? Once we use the right set of controls, things look like they should, right? Again, this is reasonably mechanical, but in terms of the magnitude, right, the initial imbalance was about, the initial sex ratio is about 1.08, right, so in favor of women, right? If we multiply this coefficient by that 0.01 change that I mentioned, it can undo about half of the gender imbalance. balance, right? So in terms of characterizing the magnitude, we move from 1.08 to about 1.04 in terms of the most affected locations. Right? So then we can think in general about demographic outcomes, right? We do see that that gender comes back toward balance. That's what that negative coefficient is, right? So the way you read this table is we've got means before, means after, and then the coefficient on that shock. Again, think about multiplying it by about 0.01 to think about comparing the most affected to the least affected municipios, right? We looked at fertility rates, we looked at infant and child mortality rates. We end up with noisy zeros for those outcomes. We do see an increase in marriage rates among 15 to 19-year-olds in response to this shock. We then also look at labor market outcomes, right? So, the big result that I had previously previewed, right, is that we see increases in employment to population ratios that are driven primarily by changes in women's labor supply. Right? So we do see it overall, but if we break it down by gender, we see that the effects are concentrated among women. Right? Some of that is happening in self-employment, and the rest is happening in formal labor market employment. Right? And then we also see that among non-migrant women, women who were in Mexico both before and after the Great Recession, right, we see a decline in wages, again comparing the most affected to the least affected municipios on the order of about 8%. Right? So that's consistent with a labor supply shift. It's also consistent, and we can look into this some more, with a change in the composition of who's working.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And one of the things that strikes me is that men's employment to population ratio in Mexico did not change. And you would think that all these returned migrants
Have
would,
stronger labor force attachment.
Where do they find jobs immediately? How come there is no change in the total employment ratio of men?
So remember, it's not immediate that we're able to, let's see, we're measuring their employment in 2010. Right, which is subsequent, which is not, immediate, right? And we're characterizing them as a returned migrant if they came back sometime between if they were in the U.S. in 2005. So there is time to find employment, and in fact,
then why did their wives go to work more and they did not?
Because it's a much lower paying job in Mexico than what they had in the U.S. Right? So. And that's actually here at the bottom, right? Despite the fact that men become reemployed and that women are working, we still see that average household monthly earnings go down, right? So even despite the fact that men remain employed, the fact that women go to work, we still end up with a typical household seeing a decline in overall monthly earnings of about 5% when you compare the most affected municipio to the least affected municipio.
I think it would also be really interesting to see what these returned migrants are doing in terms of their employment in Mexico.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe many of them just go work in the fields in their family farm or something.
Yeah, so I think that would show up as self-employed, which is part of the effect, but not all of the effect. But
there's
I'd
no
have to check
effect
on
on self-employment share
no, you're right.
of the men.
You're right. Yep.
So what are they doing?
What are they?
It would be
No, good.
interesting to explain this.
That is.
I'm finding that puzzling.
Sure. No, that should be easy to characterize. Yeah, there's one. Okay. All right, and then the last main result here is on schooling, right? So ages 6 to 12 are primary schooling, ages 13 to 15 are like middle school, junior high ages, right? There is a break in the Mexican educational system at those ages, and if you just look at the distribution of who's in school, you do see a sort of discrete drop-off typically between the 6 to 12 age group and the 13 to 15, right? So this is an age group where there is often a dropout decision, and what we see is that places that are connected to that larger negative shock are actually young people in those locations are more likely to remain in school. And so that's calculated directly here in the school attendance measure. And then if we, again, using different data, if we look at completion, right, this goes through 2015, we look at cohorts that would have been affected during this time period, we see an increase on average of about a little less than 1/10 of an extra year of schooling for individuals who were in the most affected compared to the least affected municipios. Right? So it's a meaningful increase in human capital attainment.
This is interesting, or a little puzzling too, right? Because you'd expect that the remittances would also have impacted the school attendance. So
I agree. This one
comparing the two is, I mean, I would have thought that, in fact, it might have even been the opposite.
I agree. This one easily could have gone either way, right? This one easily could have gone either way, right? There's a nice paper that David Atkin has about manufacturers that start doing manufacturing employment in Mexico, and the effects that had on schooling, and it's sort of the reverse of this, and so that's sort of what we're pointing to as an example of this potential mechanism. So when U.S. manufacturers start doing manufacturing in Mexico, it causes people to drop out of school and go take those jobs, right? And the idea here is that it's sort of the reverse, right? If you thought that you were going to be able to go to the U.S. and get a good job, then it makes sense not to continue in schooling, and once that option comes off the table, it makes sense to remain in schooling. There's also the possibility that having both parents at home changes the way that kids behave, and that's another plausible mechanism.
So one way to maybe get at that could be looking at differential effects by municipios that have either appreciable agriculture or small-scale agriculture, because those are the places where if you're constrained and you need your kids to go and work rather than go to school, they can go work on the fields, whereas they may not have other opportunities in other places. So if you saw a differential effect there, that might kind of clue you into, is it an opportunity cost story, or is it kind of this, I don't know.
Which should also align with the extent of remittances, right? So you think of the agricultural areas are probably sending back less. I mean, it might be more the household proportionally, but it might be less overall.
Right. It'd be interesting to see if people are the kids are gonna drop out to go and work presumably. So they have the opportunity to do so.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. All right, so I've now added a few things to do, thanks to your comments. Very much appreciate that. We have, like I said, we've dropped border municipios, so thinking about Mexican observations, but it could be it'd be nice to think about eliminating the U.S. side of the border in terms of the shock calculation. I like that idea. And then, the kind of story that you need to tell in terms of an omitted variable needs to be some kind of push or pull factor that's operating at the Mexican municipio level that's not absorbed by these Mexican state trends, these Mexican state fixed effects and that difference progression. One idea that we had was to think about drug violence, right, which is occurring, at a more localized level than the state level. We had difficulty getting it for all of our municipios, but for the ones that we could, right? So we weren't able to actually include it as a control yet, right? But for the ones that we could, we found that it was very weakly correlated with our measure of the shock, and so we think that that's unlikely to be an important omitted variable, right? But if there are other ideas that you have about what are those things that we should be including, I'm certainly open to that. Right? And then we have a list of things that we need to keep working on for this project, including thinking about the U.S. side of the border. All right, so I think I'm not quite, I think I've only used up the time that we spent doing introductions, so thank you. Really the big thing I want you to take away from this, right, is that the Great Recession did in fact move people from the U.S. back into Mexico, right? We sort of suspected that given what we saw in the time series, but using this more credible identification strategy, we think we've found that as well. We see non-migrant women entering the labor force and seeing their wages decline. That's consistent with an added worker story as leading to a labor supply shock. We also saw this change in human capital attainment, and I think the overall message is that in addition to things like capital flows and trade flows, migrant network, or the flow of people, and particularly through migrant networks, tend to integrate local markets across international borders. And then we hope that we're speaking to the idea of, in general, what would happen if Mexico were to lose access to the strong U.S. labor market. So we're using variation in what the U.S. labor market prospects look like that are generated from the Great Recession. We think that the effects would be plausibly similar if, say, we did something like nationwide E-Verify as an immigration enforcement measure that, again, took away access to the U.S. labor market. We think that we'd likely see similar spillovers back into the sending communities inside of Mexico. So,
I have one quick question.
Sure.
So, are you able to differentiate the return migrations due to the local shock or due to the migrants' family or friends coming back because of the shock? Maybe some migrants themselves they don't accept they're not affected by the shock, but their friends, their family go back, and that's why they don't want to stay there anymore.
Oh, sure. I see. Right. So they may not have. Yes. So it may not be that you yourself lost your job. Right?
Yeah.
No. So the real limitation is because there's no data set that actually. So if you think back to those maps, right? If I had if I had data on people in Mexico and I knew exactly where they came from and I knew what they had been doing, I could dig down into those sorts of things. What instead I have is sort of the reduced form, all of these channels combined together of, places where you tend to go, lost a lot of employment, what effect does that have in the sending community? I can't really break it down by an individual's personal experience of the Great Recession.
Yeah, so I think that question is important because think about this policy. Is the policy really relevant, or should we target at like some general population or a local economic situation, or should they target at the people or their friends, their families? So I think that's a different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for all of your comments.